The nail went in clean. Caleb Holt set the hammer down, checked the shoe against the hoof, and let the horse's leg drop. The animal shifted its weight, tested the ground, settled. Good enough to ride. Good enough to leave. That was the plan. That had been the plan since Cheyenne, since Laramie, since every town before that, going back 4 years. Stay long enough to earn what he needed. Move before anyone learned his name well enough to use it. Millhaven, Wyoming was not a remarkable town, a general store, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, 300 people who minded their own business with the efficiency of people who had enough of it to mind. Caleb had arrived 2 days ago. He had spoken to the liveryman, the store clerk, and nobody else. He was reaching for his saddlebag when the girl appeared. She came around the corner of the stable with the momentum of someone who had already decided where she was going. 6 years old, maybe 7. 2 braids listing slightly to the left, done herself in low light. Boots a size too large, worn at the toe. She stopped 2 yards from him and looked at him with the gravity of a child who has learned that the world does not explain itself and has decided to ask directly instead. "Do you know how to fix fences?" she asked. Caleb looked at her. "Depends on the fence," he said. "The one around our chicken yard. 3 boards are broken. Mama can't reach the top ones and Mr. Briggs said he'd come 3 weeks ago and he didn't." Caleb picked up his saddlebag. The girl waited with the patience of someone who had learned that waiting was sometimes the most effective form of argument. He set the saddlebag back down. "Show me," he said. The girl's name was Wren. She offered this on the walk to the property, along with the facts that she was 6 3/4, that the chickens were named Biscuit, Clover, and Mabel, that Mabel was the troublesome one, and that her mother might be surprised to see him but that it would be fine, delivered with the confidence of a child who was not entirely certain it was true but had decided it would be. The property was a modest homestead at the edge of town, a house, a barn, a chicken yard, and a kitchen garden put to bed for winter with the careful attention of someone who intended to use it again in spring. The fence had 3 broken boards, as advertised, and a 4th close to going. Caleb assessed it, retrieved tools from the barn, and fixed all 4. Wren sat on the top rail of the adjacent fence and supervised with the seriousness of a foreman who had opinions but was willing to hold them unless asked. He was finishing the last board when the kitchen door opened. Ruth Hadley came out with a dish towel in her hands and stopped when she saw him. Early 30s, dark circles under her eyes that spoke of months rather than nights, flower on her sleeve. She looked at the fence, then at her daughter, then at him, not afraid, exactly, but measuring. "Wren," she said. "He was at the livery," Wren said, as if this explained everything. "He knows how to fix things." Ruth looked at the fence. 4 boards, solid, straight. "I'm sorry Ruth started. "It's all right," Caleb said. He gathered the tools. "I'll put these back. Will you stay for supper?" He turned. Wren was looking at him with the expression of someone who had already decided the answer was yes and was waiting for him to catch up. He should have said no. He knew, in the clear and practical part of himself that had kept him alive through 4 years of war and 4 years after it, that staying for supper was the beginning of something. And beginnings had a way of requiring you to eventually explain yourself. "All right," he said. Ruth Hadley had been a widow for 8 months. Her husband Daniel had died of a fever in February, quick, which was its own particular cruelty. 1 week he was mending the barn roof. 3 weeks later he was gone, leaving Ruth with a 6-year-old daughter, 40 acres, and the specific arithmetic of grief no one warned you about, the way the practical and the unbearable arrived together every day and both required your attention. She had managed. That was the word she used when people asked. She had managed the cattle, the finances, the garden, the chickens, Wren's questions about where Papa had gone. She had held her daughter at night when the honest answers weren't enough. She had not managed to fix the chicken yard fence. It wasn't the fence itself that defeated her. It was the accumulation, the weight of every task that had been Daniel's, arriving one by one like debts she hadn't known she owed. She set 3 plates on the table. The stranger had taken the chair nearest the door, not Daniel's chair. As if he'd assessed the room and chosen accordingly. She noticed that. Caleb ate without comment. He answered Wren's questions, and there were many, with the economy of a man unaccustomed to conversation but not hostile to it. Yes, he'd been a soldier. No, not anymore. His horse was named George. He didn't know why. Wren found all of this satisfactory. Ruth watched him carefully, looking for what was underneath. He took up space in a room with a physical solidity that wasn't threatening but wasn't ignorable either. There were lines around his eyes that came from something other than sun. After supper he stood, thanked her, and said goodnight to Wren with the formal gravity of a man unsure of the protocol. Wren told him the fence on the north side of the barn needed looking at. He said he'd seen it. He left. Ruth stood at the window and told herself that was the end of it. He came back in the morning. Not to the door, to the north fence, which he'd assessed on his way out and decided to address without being asked. Ruth found him there when she came out to feed the chickens, his coat dark against the pale November sky. She brought coffee without discussing it. He took it without making it mean more than it was. This became, over the following week, a pattern neither of them named. He appeared in the mornings. There was always something that needed doing, the fence, a hinge, a section of roof that had lifted in the last wind. Wren orbited the whole arrangement with the satisfaction of someone whose plan had come together precisely as intended. Ruth knew she should say something. The town was already noticing. She could tell from the way Margaret Sears had looked at her outside the general store and then looked away too quickly. She didn't say anything. She told herself it was because the work needed doing. What she didn't tell herself, because she wasn't ready to, was that Wren had started sleeping through the night again for the first time since February. Late November, first real cold off the mountains. They were in the barn, Ruth checking a heifer, Caleb working a length of rope, and the silence between them had become, without her marking exactly when, the comfortable kind rather than the careful kind. She asked where he'd been before Millhaven. He told her. Not with the clipped deflection she'd expected. He told her about Virginia, about the wilderness, about places with names that would never mean the same thing to the people who'd been there. He used last names, the way soldiers did, as if first names were a luxury circumstances hadn't permitted. He didn't tell her how many of those names were on markers now. She understood that from the way he stopped. How long have you been moving? She asked. Since '66. 3 years of strange liveries and supper alone and nobody who knew his name. Does it help? Moving. He looked at the rope. It helped, he said. Doesn't as much anymore. She didn't ask why. She thought she knew. Wren asked him at breakfast one morning in December if he was going to stay. Ruth was at the stove. She kept her back to the room. I don't know, Caleb said. Which was honest. Which was more than most people offered. Papa used to say he wasn't going anywhere either, Wren said. And then he did. The kitchen was quiet. That wasn't his choice, Caleb said carefully. I know. Mama explained. I just wanted you to know that I know the difference. Ruth turned from the stove. Wren was eating her oatmeal with the focus of someone who had said what needed saying. Caleb was looking at the table with an expression Ruth hadn't seen on him before, not the closed stillness she'd first encountered, but something closer to a man handed something fragile, trying to determine if his hands were steady enough. He looked up and found her looking at him. Neither said anything. That was the morning Ruth understood something had shifted, and that she was going to have to decide what to do about it. One evening in December, Wren asleep in the loft, fire lower, she told him she appreciated what he'd done, and that she wasn't sure it was fair to either of them to continue without saying what it was. Caleb listened to all of it before he responded. She'd noticed he always did that. What do you think it is? He asked. I don't know, she said. That's what worries me. He looked at the fire. I've been moving 3 years because staying felt like agreeing to something I wasn't sure I deserved. He paused. I fixed your fence because a little girl asked me to. But I came back the next morning because I wanted to. That's the first time I've wanted something in a long time. I'm not asking you to do anything with that. I just thought you should know. Whined through the bare trees outside. Stay for breakfast, Ruth said. It wasn't an answer to everything. It was what she had, one morning at a time. She was learning, slowly, that this was how things got built. He stayed for breakfast. He was still there at Christmas. There are things children understand before adults do, because children have not yet learned to complicate the obvious. Wren had understood from the first afternoon, from the moment Caleb set his saddlebag down and said show me, that here was a man who needed somewhere to be as much as they needed someone to be there. The fence was broken, he could fix it, and anyone gentle with a horse who answered questions directly was probably worth keeping around. She was not wrong. By February, 1 year, nearly to the day, after Daniel Hadley died, the rhythms of the homestead had quietly rearranged themselves. Caleb had moved his few things from the livery room to the small room off the barn. Neither of them had suggested it. It had happened the way most real things happen, gradually, then all at once, then as if it had always been so. He was there when the heifer calved in January, up through the night with a lantern, patient in the way of men who have learned to wait without losing themselves to it. He was there when Wren got sick in February, sitting outside her door in the dark hallway because she'd asked him to. He was there. That was the thing, finally. The simple, insufficient, entirely adequate truth of it. There are stories about men who arrive with declarations, with the clarity of men who have never doubted their welcome. Caleb Holt was not that kind of man. What he was, a man who had spent 4 years in a war learning that everything could be taken between one breath and the next, and 4 years after it learning that moving didn't put distance between you and that knowledge, it just kept you from sitting still with it. A little girl with crooked braids had asked him to fix a fence. He fixed it. She asked him to stay for supper. And something in him, the part that had been waiting, without knowing it, for something small enough to say yes to, had said yes. He had not left after that. Not because he couldn't. Because one morning he had looked up from the north fence with the pale winter light over the mountains and Ruth had been at the kitchen door with 2 cups of coffee, and Wren had been somewhere behind her making a sound that was either an argument with the chickens or a song, and he had understood, with the clarity of a man who has been looking at something without seeing it and then finally sees it, that this was what he had been moving toward. Not away from the war. Toward this. The little girl had asked him to stay for supper. He never left after that.